Hello, hello, hi. Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started the second set of panels. As I mentioned, you're going to be seeing me quite a bit today and tomorrow. I think tomorrow there's still one more session. Now we're going to take a tag. So the whole idea behind this project was that no one would be able to pass the buckets. And so when a lot of discussions were in the previous panel about the political implications of digital platforms, we have a committee that's going to discuss exactly that. And then we have two of the subcommittee members. We have Nolan, who was the chair, and Joshua, who has also joined. And then we have two terrific commentators, John and Molly. So, Nolan, all yours.
Okay. Great. So when I was originally asked to do this, we were tasked with evaluating the political implications of the rise of large digital platforms from a variety of perspectives. The two most obvious ones were to look at the role of social media platforms in the functioning of political systems, and the second obvious one was to look at the companies that own and operate these platforms in terms of political actors. So as I want to take you through and walk you through, we looked at both of those things, but our main emphasis is going to be on how those two streams of political effects interact and complement each other in very important ways. But before I get started, let me just thank my fellow subcommittee members who are listed here. We come from a wide variety of backgrounds, people involved in political science, on the regulatory side, people involved in the evaluation of the political effects of social media, journalists, and legal scholars interested in both regulation and electoral issues. And so I'd like to thank all of them. I also like to point out a disclaimer, which is that, as you might note, these are all draft reports. So not all of those people in the first slide agree with everything that's written in the report or everything that I'm going to say. Part of what we would like from this presentation is to get feedback which could inform our ongoing deliberations, maybe resolve some of those conflicts, but in any case, just to point out that not everyone agrees with everything. Okay. So as I said, we wanted to look at the effects of the emergent social media platforms in a variety of ways. And one of the obvious ones is the role of the social media platform companies within the political sphere. So our first argument is that the concentration of social media platforms have created uniquely powerful political actors. So like the other reports, we're going to focus on the implications of concentration, monopolization, whichever term you would like. From our perspective, it matters somewhat less as to how that concentration emerged, but we're going to take as a given that it's a very concentrated space, and focus on the ways in which that has created politically powerful political actors. The second way in which we looked at, broadly speaking, the political economy of social media is to note that social media platforms have become an essential part of the political infrastructure. Early on, the evaluation of social media was that it would be a boon or a benefit to democracy. It would enable greater mobilization and engagement, marginalized populations, which would enhance democracy and challenge authoritarianism. So we discussed and we're very open about the advantages that social media have provided for better functioning, more accountable and representative political systems. At the same time, especially given recent concerns about electoral intervention, manipulation, the rise of extremism and hate on social media platforms, we obviously will focus on the role of social media and certain democratic harms in terms of undermining democracy, whether it be through polarization or extremism. And note that within authoritarian systems, these mechanisms, which can also be used for mobilization and openness, can also be used for oppression. But our main argument in the report is the way in which these two facts, we see them as facts, go together. that we're in a situation in which a vital piece of political infrastructure is under the control of a handful of firms. Now, it matters somewhat, but maybe not totally, the extent to which social media creates democratic benefits or harms, but the fact that it is an important piece of the infrastructure and it is under the control of such few firms and individuals is a point of concern which we deal with. As will become apparent, many of the issues about the enhancements and detractions from democracy from social media are quite identical to things like the printing press, or the emergence of the newspaper, cable television. But we're going to argue that this additional factor of the enhanced political power of the firms involved makes it somewhat unique and different. So we spent a lot of time in the report unpacking an argument that social media platforms are uniquely politically powerful. What we argue is that there are really 4 or 5 features of the political influence of social media platforms in whose combination very few corporations or other political actors have ever benefited from. First and most obvious benefit to a social media platform company in terms of concentration and economic power is that those economic power and resources can translate into political power. Second, we argue that social media platforms, in the extent to which they operate in a space that's somewhat like a publisher or a media outlet, can make special claims to First Amendment protections that other corporations and other political actors may not be able to do. We argue that the industry itself is quite complex, opaque, not entirely transparent in terms of how its policies affect citizen welfare and the welfare of democracies. Fourth, we argue that social media platforms are uniquely connected both to their customers and users, and in the case of firms and platforms in the share economy, connected to the workers in ways in which can be able to exploit opportunities for mobilization. And finally, in an issue that came up briefly this morning, social media platform companies can and are making arguments that they're national champions in international competition for advantages in technology and AI. And given the current era of economic nationalism, we expect that these will be very important arguments for them to make. Now I want to walk through each of these and argue the ways in which social media platforms benefit from them. It may seem odd at a current time in which we're holding conferences like this and the executives of Google and Facebook are routinely called up to Capitol Hill to testify, face positioning of Democratic candidates for their breakup and so forth, to talk about the political power of social media. But in some sense, this is exactly the moment in which we can contemplate reforms, because ultimately these attributes will remain in the future, and anything we do today has to be able to be consistent with a world in which social media platforms will maintain significant political powers. So let me talk about these in turn. So perhaps I should belabor least the role of economic resources in creating political power. There are some obvious direct ways in which large firms are politically powerful. One which political scientists might call structural reasons. Politicians who tend to get reelected when the economy is going strong and growing with the support of important economic sectors are going to be loath to take policy positions or take policy actions which will harm or restrain those things. So if social media platform companies did nothing on their own in the political realm, there would be lots of deference to them from policymakers for these structural reasons. But it's not the case at all that social media companies are avoiding activism. In fact, as the report documents, there is a lot of political activity going on by almost all of the major digital platforms. As we mentioned earlier, if you just take as a measure of economic power, the 5 largest market caps were Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, Microsoft, and Facebook. Those together combined for $39 million in campaign contributions to federal candidates. So it's a very large number. It turns out, however, that campaign contributions is not the forte of these companies. It's actually direct lobbying. If you look at direct lobbying data from OpenSecrets.com, you find that Alphabet, Amazon, and Facebook were the 1st, 5th, and 8th most prolific spenders on direct lobbying among American corporations. It should be noted that 3 of the remaining 8 are also communications companies, but they're not in this space, and the others are major defense contractors. So they're extremely engaged in lobbying, and they lobby on a very wide array of issues. This is especially true of Amazon because it's not only a digital platform, it's a retailer, it's involved in shipping and so forth, but it's also true of Alphabet and Facebook as well, that the spread of the issues that they lobby on are among the biggest in corporate America. And their expenditures in lobbying has been growing somewhat tremendously over time. Here are the 5 major platform companies here. It should be noted that for the average corporation, these expenditures have been going down for a variety of perhaps data reasons, but the fact that these are all increasing in time in which the median corporation's direct lobbying expenditures is going down shows you that the role of lobbying in this sector has gone up, both in absolute terms and in relative terms. The second issue has to do with First Amendment protections. Platforms can claim protection against certain government regulation of content and certain types of disclosures about users. They will often say publicly that they're not publishers, but say in court that they are. This is particularly salient given a provision of the Communications Decency Act of 1996 that basically immunizes the platforms against litigation based on things that users publish. Firms both benefit from the claim that they are publishers protected by First Amendment, and they benefit from the claim that they're not publishers so that they have these protections. Complexity is an important part of the story. The technology and algorithms underlying social media platforms are very complex. One of the things that we face as a committee is that the research on the political implications of social media is fairly nascent. It's in its early stages. Mainly it's because the currently available data doesn't exist outside the platforms. So almost all of the research that's done on the ways in which Facebook, Google, and other algorithms may affect democratic processes is done internally, and we only get to see the results that say that there's nothing to see here. And so that's an important issue that we have to consider. And third, obviously, and this is true almost in any regulatory environment, that the technical expertise and issues are going to be concentrated in the industry, and the ability of government regulators to match those human capital will be difficult. Fourth, these firms are highly connected. We argue that few firms have the ability to directly interact with their customers and their workers, while at the same time having such sophisticated data on their political preferences. So we think this is an opportunity for them to use this in terms of engagement in political campaigns and activities. In addition to users, we have employees. And so in a way, we argue that the social media platforms are less like corporations in this regard and much more like large membership organizations such as the National Rifle Association or the American Association of Retired Persons, who exploit their connectivity and their information about members to conduct major mobilization campaigns. And finally, the national champions argument. Technology sector has begun to make national interest and security arguments in response to the success of international competitors, especially those Chinese firms. They argue that these firms have grown due to the government support of the Chinese government, as well as their ability to engage in massive vertical and horizontal integration. And the concern of our committee is that these arguments are going to be very potent ones politically in fending off any antitrust policies or any other competition policies. So by way of summary, we argue that essentially we have a situation where the social media platforms combine the political attributes of General Motors as a national champion, big Wall Street financial firms in terms of complexity and economic resources, U.S. Steel, the New York Times in terms of First Amendment protections, along with the National Rifle Association. So that combination is quite a potent one if we're going to contemplate regulating, even now during a period in which these firms are politically unpopular, but also to have regulations with some staying power and ability to prevent capture in the future. Okay, the second thing the report does is it kind of outlines what we know and don't know about what we might call the political externalities of social media platforms. Social media platforms were not created to be part of the political infrastructure of the United States and other democracies. They were not created to be challenges to authoritarian leaders. Most users do not get on those platforms for those purposes. So to some extent, the transformation of these platforms into this important piece of political infrastructure is a byproduct of a business model which is focused on user engagement and the collection of data. Now, as Nate personally in another report notes, that there are certain features of social media which sort of led the way for these political externalities that become important. First is the velocity in which information can spread, the virality by which it can move through networks. It's anonymity, which allows for harassment, hate speech, and extremism, as well as homophily, which allows subgroups to carve themselves off into thought bubbles, etc. Now, of course, all of these things were true of previous communications technologies. Printing press, cable television, broadcast television, newspapers. What we argue is really the combination of these factors in a world in which these network externalities create such high levels of concentration, in which we have these features of democratic processes being controlled by a few firms. I think Josh will say a little bit more about the details of some of these, but I think anyone reading the newspaper recognizes the potential for social media to be involved in political mobilization, political engagement, its ability to open up communication spaces to the marginalized information gatekeepers, but the more negative ones, such as political polarization, the manipulation of information, and harmful speech. Now, we recognize that some of these are democratic attributes, some of these are democratic harms, but at the end of the day, it's the fact that such an important piece of infrastructure, that these externalities are controlled by such few firms, are what gives the committee pause and helps push us toward thinking something should be done. Okay, so let me just briefly summarize our recommendations. First, we concur with the other subcommittees that some new regulatory authorities could be necessary. Now, in our role as political scientists and lawyers, we focused a lot on the regulatory structural issues that would have to be faced. We face a fundamental dilemma in creating new regulatory structures in terms of, on one hand, wanting to prevent industry capture, but on the other hand, wanting to avoid the capture of elected politicians and parties. Because again, this space is really not just a pure, essentially our argument is this space is not purely an economic one. which we only worry about industry capture. It's at the middle of the political system, and we have to be worried about designing authorities to prevent political manipulation, both by the firms and by elected officials. We endorse to some extent greater antitrust enforcement or other competition policies, but with perhaps a focus on preventing some of the effects of political market concentration. So that was a debated issue this morning about how much these political concerns should be. We're going to argue that the political externalities of social media are ones that could perhaps be remedied by less concentration. On the issue of platform liability, I'll come back to this in a second when we come back to the question and answer. We don't take a position on platform liability. There's a division on the committee with respect to those who think that eliminating the immunity of the platforms from litigation would cause them to regulate speech too much, and those who would suggest it would do too little. So we can come back to that in discussion. We deal with issues related to the role of social media in campaigns and elections, primarily with a focus on the United States, and how we can reform the campaign disclosure related to social media in ways that make it more transparent. We make some arguments with respect to philanthropic disclosure to deal with the fact that much of the research on the political impacts of social media platforms is either done internally within the platform companies or is done with the blessing of the platform companies in exchange for their data and other resources. And then essentially to deal with that issue even more in depth, we make some recommendations for increased data access for academic and independent research. We think this both is an important reform both in understanding the political consequences of social media, but also relates to some of the questions about not having enough data to evaluate some of its economic effects. Okay, so just to outline some of the arguments we make in terms of this new regulatory authority. We joined the other subcommittees in calling it the Digital Authority. We can be somewhat agnostic about whether it should be in the Federal Trade Commission or whether it should be standalone. I think there are some good political economy arguments for making it independent, both in terms of the autonomy of its mission and the ability to avoid industry and or political capture. We want the Digital Authority to have autonomy from industry influences, but at the same time it needs some protection from political influences. We see it as having a jurisdiction that covers many social media related functions as possible in order to prevent regulatory fragmentation across those. There are some exceptions there. It's hard for us to see that the new Digital Authority can regulate campaign finance laws because we worry more about the fragmentation of campaign finance laws across agencies. And to deal with issues where we can't have unique jurisdictions for the firm, we need to have mechanisms for coordination with other agencies. Here, just a list. I'll just leave it up there for you to read. We see it as having responsibility for rulemaking across a variety of areas. Importantly, given our concerns about transparency, complexity, and opacity, we argue the Digital Authority should have mechanisms for real-time data collection from the platforms, subject, of course, to appropriate protections for user privacy. The Digital Authority should increase research capacity, its own research capacity to undertake studies of the impact of the platforms on social and political outcomes, but also facilitate research and facilitate independent research by outside scholars. Should have some authority to review relevant internal studies and where appropriate make them publicly available. And we're very concerned, as was mentioned earlier, that any new kind of regulatory authorities would have an anti-competitive effect. So we stress the importance of rules and regulations that promote innovation and competition in digital media sphere. In terms of antitrust and competition, one of the challenges that we face is one that was mentioned earlier, is that simply the data available to assess the political harms of social media policies and algorithms is fairly rudimentary at this point. So there is some difficulty in determining what sort of standards should be used in evaluating the political impacts of mergers. So we sort of think that the first step is to open up the data, make it available so that such standards can be developed. And then ultimately that might evolve into a system of dual review where the digital authority makes some recommendations to the antitrust authority with regard to the political impacts of the merger. Let me skip over that. Finally, I'm about to run out of time. I can talk more about the other ones in question and answer. Perhaps some of the more tangible things we focus on involve the role of social media in campaigns and elections. To that end, we endorse certain procedures of an existing act before Congress, the Honest Ads Act, which has two important disclosure mandates. The first is to amend the definition of electioneering communication to include internet or digital communication. To date, it focuses on more traditional methods of communication, television and newspaper. One of the issues we confront is that as written, the act focuses on the disclosure by the platforms of the amount of money spent on the platforms. But there's a loophole related to the fact that social activist campaigns can essentially coordinate social media campaigns in which no actual money is spent on the platforms and have an effect. So we also would go further and include coordinated social media campaigns and put the onus on those campaigns to report their expenditures, even if they didn't come through the platforms. Second, we endorse a mandate that the digital platforms compile databases of political advertisements that are run on the forums. And go further in suggesting that disclosure requirements on political advertising be paid for by foreign entities, whether it's electioneering or not. And then the last issue we dealt with is one that's somewhat tricky. There's lots of concerns about non-neutrality of the platforms with respect to politics, whether or not search algorithms benefit Democrats or Republicans or conservatives or liberals, whether Facebook's embedding of its employees in certain campaigns is done in a fair and equitable way. We're concerned at First Amendment issues. In a world of Citizens United where corporations have speech rights, we're worried about a ban on non-neutrality, but we argue that disclosure of non-neutral policies and algorithmic changes should be part of any reform. Just briefly, how much time do I have? A little bit over. So philanthropic disclosure is really important. As we mentioned, a disproportionate share of research on social media is actually supported by the companies. It's done internally or done with researchers who depend on the firms for access. So we think that such support should be better disclosed by both donors and recipients. And then finally, I think this is the key of everything, which is that we just don't know enough about the political impacts of social media platforms. And so opening up the data for academic and independent research is really crucial, whether we're concerned about the political harms, the harms to consumers, or any other harms. So we argue that more should be done to open up the research. It should be a major initiative of the Digital Authority to facilitate this. One of the issues, of course, is the extent to which data is proprietary to the platforms. But we argue, for a variety of reasons, there should be some reconsideration of the extent to which it should be considered proprietary with respect to the platforms, given its large impacts on the political and economic system of the United States and other democracies. So let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now we turn to Molly, please.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Molly Roberts. I'm an associate professor at the University of California, San Diego. I'm really happy to be here. I really enjoyed reading this white paper and having the opportunity to engage with it. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Just a little background about myself. I study mostly the impact of social media control, and authoritarian regimes, in particular in China. So I'm very familiar with the literature on the influence of social media on politics, but mostly I think about it in authoritarian contexts. I also use a lot of data in my research, so I am also very interested in understanding how data is used to understand the political implications of social media platforms. So just to give you, as my comments go along, I think this will provide some context of where I'm coming from. So this is just to give a very quick summary of what this white paper is discussing. The argument of the paper is that social media platforms are very powerful and potentially politically problematic. There are ways in which they provide political infrastructure that could have some adverse consequences. So the white paper goes through a lot of different sources of power of social media companies, that they are large and wealthy, some of them at least, that they are media outlets, so that they are providing media to many people, that they have a lot of connectivity with their users, and this provides them with a lot of access to what users see, but also a lot of data about user behavior. The policies of how this information is provided to users can be somewhat opaque. They're algorithmic. We might not understand all of their consequences. And another source of power is that they could be thought of in this international context of competition over AI between countries. They could be thought of as national champions, and so that could also increase their power. And besides having all of these sources of power, that they also provide political infrastructure, and we think they have some big political impacts. Although the literature on this, as Nolan said, is sort of nascent, and so we're not really sure about all of their political impacts. So we think that these social media platforms have done some to mobilize and engage users. So maybe on the positive side, we think that social media in general has a political mobilization effect. It also may have some sort of political engagement effect, although still the literature is a little bit mixed on this. And more recently, the adverse social consequences of these platforms have sort of come more to the fore, which is they might also be able or more able than traditional media to spread misinformation, facilitate harassment, and facilitate polarization, although still the results on these are somewhat nascent. So there's a lot more we need to explore here. So one thing I kept thinking about as reading this white paper is really when we think about how social media platforms differ from traditional media, of all of these factors, which are those that are most important? Which are the biggest differences between traditional media and social media platforms are along which dimensions? So certainly we have media conglomerates. Traditional media also provides media, so they are media outlets. There is some opaqueness in how media decide what stories to report on, what to give to users. And of course, these media outlets, traditional media, also has influence on politics. But I think that the biggest dimension that was mentioned in this white paper that is different between social media and traditional media is this idea of connectivity and data, right? So social media platforms have more access and more interaction with individual users than traditional media has had. And this is maybe, this is sort of what I want to focus my comments on in the source of their power and the potential for providing political infrastructure having influence on politics. So why does this data matter? So as you guys all know, this is incredibly detailed data that social media platforms have on users. It contains a lot of information about individual users' social interaction, their individual media consumption, and also other types of metadata on their everyday activities. It can be linked to other things that they are doing outside of what is on the social media platform. And in particular, this data is very fine-grained. It occurs by the minute, by the day. It occurs repeated over and over and over again. And of course, this data is part of the economic model of these social media platforms. This data provides the ability for the social media platforms to provide better services. It also to target advertisements, and therefore this is part of the fundamental economic model of these platforms. But of course, this has huge political consequences and can potentially have huge political consequences. So just thinking, I think about this a lot in the context of China, and we think about this aggregated data on social media platforms in China. We start to become very worried about the increase in authoritarianism, the ability for the lack of a barrier between government and companies to have influence on politics within authoritarian regimes, right? So this aggregation of data provides a lot of power because there's a capacity to sort of engineer social influence on with this aggregation of data and with the platform itself. So we know that that content can be targeted toward users, this targeting of content can be more powerful with experimentation, right? And in an authoritarian context, we worry about the experimentation, political experimentation on these types of platforms in order to manipulate political belief, right? And certainly we may not worry about this as much within our own context, but if these platforms could be used for political purposes, they could be potentially very politically powerful. This type of targeting is sometimes visible to the user and sometimes invisible to the user, and so it's difficult for users to know exactly how information is being served to them. Even if the platform itself does not have any political intention, we have seen that it can be leveraged by other outside actors to target content toward users. So the data itself can be used by advertisers for political means. In general, we just don't know very much in our own social science research about what types of political influence this can have and what impact it can have on democracy. So the white paper, so this is sort of a reframing of the source of power in the white paper, and the policy prescription that it seems like most of the authors in the white paper seem to really gather around is that more research and transparency is needed to really understand what impact this type of targeting and the platform itself has on politics. So the main policy prescriptions in the white paper that I'm going to focus on talking about is a digital authority whose main function would be to coordinate research both inside and externally to the company, and transparency in political campaigns and philanthropy. So the idea that if we knew more about the political impacts of this type of data, we would better be able to understand it, its influence in politics. So the idea is if we understood these social consequences, if we were able to sort of audit company decisions that could have big political impacts, if we could educate the public on how information was being served to them, then maybe this would provide some good political externalities. In general, this comes from the fact that in political science, in this study of social media, there's just a lot we don't know about the political impacts of social media. And the white paper really stresses that, but I want to stress it again, is that research in this area is so important because we really don't know a lot of what political consequences these platforms are having. So to give you an example, I think that a lot of times we see harassment on social media platforms, and the automatic reaction to this is this type of information should be removed from platforms, right? But there is some research in political science that shows that people seeing harassment can then decrease their opinion of the harasser, right? So if we move harassment-related messages from social media, then maybe we are actually we're actually benefiting the harasser more than hurting them. So I think the jury's really out on whether or not this is true, but we need some more data, we need some more understanding of what the implications of these policies are before thinking about implementing them. We also know that there's a lot of misinformation on these political platforms, but we have very little data on how this misinformation impacted belief, right? So maybe we have some assumptions about how people consume misinformation, how that affects their political opinions, but we don't really have a lot of data on this. And so I wholeheartedly endorse and agree with this white paper's prescription of having more research and transparency on the part of the platform in order to understand what the social consequences of this new political infrastructure are. So here are some lingering questions I have maybe to start a debate about what this ability, what more research and transparency, what effect it would have on this situation. So one question I had for the white paper is, well, what is the mechanism of accountability? So say there was research that uncovered a negative impact of social media platforms' decision on the political sphere. How would what mechanism of accountability, even if the public knew about that research, what is the mechanism of accountability? One option would be consumers could leave this social media platform, but the question is, would they actually leave, and where would they go, right? Given that these platforms are so concentrated, this research seems to be, or our understanding of these political consequences seems to be needs to be paired with more competition in the social media space in order for consumers to be able to do the accountability. We could rely on companies to then change their policies if it was found out that they had political negative externalities. But the report talks about how companies have so much power that it may not be that we can rely on them to make or to self-regulate. So what is, would they actually be held accountable in that case? We could, the report sort of implies we could think about government regulation of content, but of course this has huge First Amendment consequences, and we start looking more and more authoritarian in this case, right? So there's huge problems with that approach as well. So I think trying to understand what the mechanism of accountability, I was left with a lot of questions about this. The other question I had was, who will set the research agenda? So if there is a digital authority to coordinate research, would academics set this agenda? Would the public set this agenda? If there was a political appointee that was in charge of this authority, would politics end up setting this agenda? And how would we think about who decides what research to conduct? A third question I had was, can transparency empower bad actors? So as we publish more about the political consequences of social media, are there instances in which revealing this type of information can actually empower bad actors? And then the last two questions I had is one is data enough? So the report talks a lot about how data, or the provision of data, is really important to enable social science research. But as somebody who uses a lot of data in social science research, we know that observational data is really difficult to use to understand the impact of policies or social media platforms, for example, on politics. So if we have a lot of observational data, we are going to have a lot of confounding, and we're not necessarily going to be able to piece out a lot of the cause and effect within this data. And so in particular, if a lot of this observational data is, there are many points in the time series of the data where the social media company has changed its algorithm or changed its policy, right? We might not know when those points occurred, and then we might confuse those points with cause and effect in the data when they're actually changing company policies. So some transparency about what experiments were run on the data and how the algorithm changed in the midst of this research data would be really important to understanding it. Last, on the is this data enough, we also might want to try to understand the algorithm. So there's this move in social sciences to try to understand algorithm behavior. And a part of this is using platforms to experiment, say setting up 2 different social media accounts and then trying to understand how algorithms influence those accounts differently, right? But of course, this is very difficult to do on some social media platforms. And so is provision of data enough for research, or would we also want to be able to use experiments on the platform with accounts in order to try to back out how the algorithm is influencing different types of people differently? And last, I think what's interesting about the white paper is it has this sort of catch-22, which is social media companies are very powerful, and so this digital authority, is it possible in the current political context? And I think that those are other questions to open up to discussion. So thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to our rest of our discussion.
Thank you. All yours, John.
Great. So my name is John DeFigueiredo. I'm a professor at Duke University. I have a joint appointment in the law school and the business school. And my research is generally I study business strategy and innovation in regulated industries. And most of my work sits at the intersection of business and government, thinking about that intersection and how those two interact. So what I'd like to do today is I'd just like to lay out the argument, and I'll do it very quickly because I think Molly did it nicely, and talk about what I think the contributions of this report are. And then I'm going to have 4 comments of things that I think would help to focus the discussion a little bit. Much like Molly did with questions, I'm going to have some comments and show you a little bit of data. So the argument in the paper, the way I read it, was that it starts off by saying platforms are powerful political actors, and that platforms in turn influence political systems. This in turn, and I've kind of itemized all the things that Nolan was talking about. And the key fact here is that we could do self-regulation. We could let the platform self-regulate, but they don't have the incentive to self-regulate. There's a lot of incentives that push them away from self-regulation. And I think that we haven't really talked much about that, but that would be a good thing to talk about in the discussion. I'm not going to highlight that. But the question is, do they have an incentive to self-regulate? And if what do those incentives look like? I think that would be an interesting discussion point. And because of this problem, they're going to make a whole series of recommendations. They start from regulatory structure to antitrust law to a bunch of disclosure regulations and laws. So they have a whole bunch of things that they're going to recommend. So this is the basic structure of the report. So what do I like about this? So I like about this that they talk about the impact of powerful platforms on politics in 2 different dimensions. And I think they've really hit upon, there's 2 different problems in politics here. The first problem in politics is that we have this question of what's going on with our end users. How are the end users being affected through harmful speech, through mobilization? There's a whole bunch of things that happen to the end users, in essence to our customers. So there's a whole bunch of political actions that happen to our customers, and they're going to discuss that. And then the second thing is we ourselves are political actors as platform companies. And there's a whole political economy story going on. And I think that what the report does is it usefully separates out these 2 ideas, and then we'll try to combine them into its recommendation. So that's the first thing. And I think often we lose sight of this conversation between the difference between what's going on with our customers and the product we're creating, and what's going on with us as political actors. So there's 2 separate things going on here. The second thing I think that's interesting about the paper is its breadth and depth of analysis. So the way the committee was formed, it has political scientists, it has people who study social media, people who study agency design, people who study regulation. So even though it's pretty broad, it actually goes through and really kind of gets to the meat of each of the issues in which it hits because of the breadth of the expertise of the committee, which I thought was nice. It was also very clear in saying this is what we know and this is what we don't know. And I'll come back to this in talking about data transparency because this is a theme I think we're going to be hearing a lot about and from a lot of the committees. And finally, they think of this as a system-wide problem rather than, as Luigi was saying earlier, one little thing happening at a time. Let's bring everyone in the room together and think of this as a system-wide problem. So these are some of the contributions. Now, I'm going to make 4 comments about the report. So the first comment is it's more about how you organize the report. It's not that I don't think you've organized it correctly. It's that I think you could tell a more coherent story in the report itself. I think what I'm going to add to their thing is I'm going to add stuff in red. Sorry, I ran out of slide space, so I put this one sideways. So they start off with this idea, and I think actually Nolan kind of told the story when he was talking, but it doesn't read this way in the report. So platforms are concentrated, and they're going to be around for a long time. And they rely on the market structure report to kind of establish that fact. So they're not going to go into whether this is how it arises, but this is a fact. This then in turn means that their product will be used for a very long time to influence politics. And there's a bunch of political goods that will happen. Those are the top 3, and a bunch of political bads that will happen. Those are the bottom 3. So they're long-standing platforms. These are going to be the players, and they're going to influence politics. Then the next point, I think, in this story is they don't have an incentive to self-regulate. Moreover, I think what they're trying to say in the report is that the platforms themselves are powerful political actors and will thwart any kind of regulation. So they don't have an incentive to self-regulate, and they have but they do have an incentive to try to mitigate external regulation. And so because of that, what the committee's trying to do is they're trying to make recommendations that overcome the political actions of the powerful political actors. And I'm not sure that they've done this exactly well, to say, these people are very powerful political actors, and these recommendations overcome those concerns of they will get captured, they will do this, they'll do a whole bunch of things in order to stop regulation. I don't think they've closed that loop as well. Also, I think another loop they haven't closed as well is to explain how these regulations will ensure we still get the political goods out of the platforms while killing the political bads. That is, there's a danger we'll kill the political goods as well. And we want to make sure that we kill the political goods and don't kill political bads. And I think that logic is, that you keep the political goods, you keep the political goods and you kill the political bads. And I don't think that they've kind of closed that loop in the report. Okay, so that's a structure. And so Molly was talking about the stuff mainly on the left-hand side of the picture when she was talking about how social media works. And I'm going to be talking mainly about the right-hand side of the picture, the political economy of these companies. And I'm going to be focusing on my last comments are focused on 3 questions. The first is, how politically powerful are they? The second question, I'm going to be talking about data transparency and the solution, which is the 6th item on the recommendations. And finally, I'm going to talk about how would you think about agency design. If you're going to set up a digital authority, it looks really good to do that on paper, but when you actually try to do that, it's actually really hard. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. So those are my 3 comments generally. So Molly did a nice job, and Nolan did a nice job of talking about the ability of these companies to engage in political action. We see Uber mobilizing drivers and mobilizing its passengers in order to get political action. Well, you can also think about this lobbying effect. Let me show you the top 20 lobbyists in 2018 in the United States. So this is by expenditures. And what I've done here is I've listed the top 20, and I've told and how much they spend. This is from the Open Secrets database. The green ones that I've highlighted are all regulated companies or regulated industries. The yellow ones are the platform companies, and the ones that are not highlighted are, well, you could debate how regulated Boeing and Lockheed Martin are. You could call them defense contractors. You could think of them as regulated. It's unclear, right? But the point is, except for the Chamber of Commerce, the Open Society Policy Center, and the Business Roundtable, which are effectively large business organizations and trade associations, these are all regulated companies and platform companies. So it turns out that these companies, these platform companies, lobby like regulated companies. Now, I'm not going to attribute causation. I'm just going to say they lobby like regulated companies. Okay, so you can further break this down and see what they're lobbying on. So I chose a regulated company, which the report doesn't do. It talks about how much these guys are lobbying. But this is AT&T. This is a heavily regulated company. And you can actually see, you can't see from the slide, but what they lobby on is they lobby on telecommunications is their #1 topic area. And then they lobby on a whole bunch of other issues, but they're generally general kinds of issues that companies might care about. Tax, intellectual property, torts, healthcare, and trade. So this is what AT&T lobbies on. So this is the top. Let me show you what Alphabet and Google lobbies on. Okay, so this is Google's lobbying. Now, first of all, that big area on top, that big orange area on top, that's out, sorry, what happened here? Oh, okay, I lost it on this. Can I get this fixed? This pink on top, sorry, I did Facebook, so I'm gonna go back to that one. This pink on top, so this is their top 7 issues, and then everything else is other issues they lobby on. So it turns out Google or Alphabet, it becomes Google, it turns into Alphabet during the data set. Google lobbies on tons of stuff. They're lobbying not as focused as AT&T, they're lobbying on tons of stuff. And I want to tell you what 3 of their top issue they lobby on is intellectual property. But their next 3 issues they lobby on are telecommunications, labor and antitrust, and consumer protection. These sound like regulated issues, right? So they're lobbying in areas which you may think are kind of regulatory issues. So they're lobbying at the magnitude of regulatory companies, and they're kind of lobbying a little bit like regulatory companies in the issue areas they're setting, right? So, I mean, this is all suggestive. This is by no means definitive, right? And you can look at Facebook. Facebook has also tons of lobbying going on. I don't have time to go into Facebook. But let me take a deeper dive into Facebook and say, what you can do is you can also map who they're hiring for their lobbying. That is, Facebook has their own. The top part of this picture has, Facebook has its own. Actually, can I go to the wireless mic? Okay. So Facebook has its own internal lobbyists, and then they hire a bunch of lobbyists, and these are the issues they lobby on, and this is who they're targeting. And so what's happening is you can actually follow the flows of the money and who the political economy, who they're targeting. Now, I didn't go into more depth in this, but we actually know whose bills they're trying to kill and whose bills they're trying to support. So we can actually go into that as well. So the point is that these guys lobby a little bit like regulatory companies. So I'm not saying they should be regulated or not be regulated. I'm just saying they lobby like regulated companies. You can also take Facebook here in 2009 and say, what were they lobbying on? Well, what they were lobbying on was they were lobbying on, this is intellectual property, as a media company, trade, civil rights. So they had a huge amount of lobbying going on in civil rights within 2009. By 2017, they're lobbying on just a whole bunch of different issues. So they're basically, as they grow, they lobby on more issues, which is not surprising, but they lobby on issues that may be in areas that you may think should be regulated. In addition, I just want you to see the scale. This was 70,000, this is 1.4 million. Okay, so these are scales are shifting a lot as well. Okay, so I guess the point I'm trying to make is these are very powerful companies. Along all the dimensions that the report discusses, the amount of cash they have, the amount of political influence they have, their ability to influence people, it's really a lot on a lot of the dimensions. So if you're concerned about the political power of the companies in thwarting regulatory policy, you have to think a lot about, could I design a regulatory structure that would be immune or at least minimize this political economy story? The second story I want to ask, the second point I want to make, the third point I want to make is on transparency and data. So this has come up over and over and again, and there's a lot of issues that come up in transparency and data and what kind of data should be available. I actually think this is one of the big issues across all the committees, is there's not enough data. The companies hold it, whether you're talking about market structure, politics, media, privacy, the regulatory structures, researchers don't. And there's lots of solutions to problems like this, right? So companies, the census has ways of having data be made available, researchers be independently assigned. The NSF would probably take the data, we would say, okay, would set up a program to analyze platform companies and allow people to apply directly. But the point is you want a lot of independent research. And I think because the data is not available and the companies hold the data, this is an issue which I think you don't necessarily need a regulatory authority to engage in. The companies themselves could cede the data to an independent authority like the NSF and let qualified researchers look at that kind of data. But this will come up over and over again, I'm sure, in discussion as well. The final thing I want to talk about is agency design. How would you design an agency? So one of the recommendations is the digital authority should have a reasonable degree of autonomy from industry influence to make decisions about social media platforms in the public interest. Who wouldn't want that, right? This sounds pretty good, right? This objective for an agency just sounds great, right? It's like mom and apple pie. But the question is, how do you actually design an agency when these actors are so very powerful in order to try to achieve that? And so when you begin to think about this problem, the report starts along these lines, first of all, if you decide to set up a regulatory agency, there's a question of how's that going to be controlled? Is it going to be political control, or are you going to give it political autonomy? Well, it turns out the government has a lot of examples of this. So the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Fed, pretty independent, not a lot of politics going on there. On the other end, you have things like not a lot of politics in a political spectrum, right? Relative to a political spectrum compared to OSHA and the Bureau of Land Management, right? Which are sitting inside the Department of Labor, sitting inside the Department of Interior, which report directly to the president, and every regulation is approved by the White House. So these are very, very different kinds of structures. And then you have a whole set of agencies in between. You have the FCC, the SEC, the FEC, the EPA. And the point is that there's just a whole set of choices you have to make. And the problem is if you try to move too far to political control, then what happens is you have the potential to turn these platforms, get massive amount of political control, and turn these into like MSNBC or Fox News, and they become the tools of the politicians. On the other hand, if you're over here on a political autonomy, what you're going to get is you're going to get an agency which is more insulated from the politics, but actually what's happening is they do stuff and there's no way to control them, and they might do stuff that you don't want them to do. So it turns out when you think about this choice of how you set up an agency, the details matter a lot. It's easy to say on paper, but it's really hard to do in practice to make these trade-offs, is you want an expert agency which is based on fact and analysis, which is basically based on an expert civil service that does careful analysis, but you also want an agency which is responsive to democratic principles and electorate in order to respond. And one of the core choices that someone has to make is how do you set up the agency? So with that said, I think the last question you want to ask is this one. Do the recommendations overcome the political power of the platform companies? So that's the picture I showed, and I said, I think the report needs to address that question about how these recommendations overcome that political power. So in the end, I think this is a really, very vibrant report. It's got a lot of structure to it. It's got a lot of thoughtfulness to it. It does address the two key issues. And I think it does, though, pose a lot of questions that could be discussed. Thank you.
So Josh, you have the right of first response. Let us know what the solutions are.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for Nolan and Luigi and Filippo for inviting me to be a part of this committee. Yeah, I was given the right of first response and had to make up my remarks before I knew what anyone was going to say during those responses. So I'm going to overlap a little bit, but I'm going to give my take on things. And because Nolan kind of comes from the political economy wing of the committee, I'll give a tiny little background on myself, but I was more from the social media and politics. I'll elaborate on some of the points that were made there. Just a tiny bit of background on myself. I'm a professor of politics at NYU, and for about 7 years ago, I was one of a few people who set up something called the NYU Social Media and Political Participation, or SMAP Lab. And for the last 6, 7 years, we've actually been trying to study the relationship between social media and politics and all sorts of ways to use social media data to study politics in new and kind of interesting and exciting ways. So I want to take the 10 minutes or so that I have right now just to make a few additional points, some which are going to bring up things that have been made before. First, in kind of contrast to the discussion this morning, I want to be very clear that we want to begin from this idea that the political benefits of social media, right, the benefits of social media or the political spillovers from social media into the political arena are both positive and negative, right? This is a nuanced situation. There are things that we think of as having positive effects on politics and things that we think of as having negative effects on politics. But the starting point here isn't to say, as Nolan was saying, that yes, this was built to connect people with their friends from high school and their friends from college. It's a communications tool, and all of a sudden it had all these impacts on politics, and they're all unambiguously negative, so we got to figure out a way to remedy that situation. It's much more complex than that. And we go into the detail on this in the report. We set up all these different effects that we think social media has had on the political spectrum. We sort of roughly order them from positive to negative, but even within the categories, it's not all clear. And I want to just give one example of this to show sort of the nuanced situation that's here, right? So one thing that we think social media has done is that it has given access to people who didn't have access to mainstream media. So people who were previously excluded from political discussions because of gatekeepers in the form of mainstream media, they now have ways to find followers, they have ways to coordinate action, they have ways to communicate with one another, they have ways to become politically active. Right? Now, in some ways, right, this could be something that a lot of people might think of as very positive. If you think about this in authoritarian countries, that might include people who are pro-democracy activists, right? Remember, social media was, when it first burst onto the scene, as Larry Diamond famously put it, liberation technology, right? That was the political spillover. In established democracies, you can think about people who are on the sort of marginalized communities in established democracies, who might be on the more progressive side of politics, who have been excluded from debate. And you think about Black Lives Matter or Occupy Wall Street or some of these people giving voices to. On the same respect, you also have in established democracies people who were excluded from political discussion as kind of illiberal forces and sort of anti-democratic forces and sort of these things that we might think of as anti-systemic or threatening to democracy, a lot of what we talk about now. But it's the same affordances of social media that help both these sort of marginalized actors who we might think this is a very normatively good thing that they're getting access to politics, or help pro-democracy activists in authoritarian countries organize when they're excluded from access to media. These are the same affordances that have led to these questions, what we're talking about now, this kind of, as Nate Persley also put it in the same journal, can democracy survive the internet? So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to emphasize, and I did not coordinate with Molly or John or anyone about this ahead of time, but is that there really is a lot we don't know. And I think this is a particular, so the problem is exacerbated by a couple of things. One is data access, which I'll talk about in a second. But even putting aside the question of data access, and which is a huge question, which I'm going to come back to, there's a structural issue here, right? Which is why we don't know a lot about what's going on social media platforms. Which is, these are massive, massive sources of data. Right? There is just tons of data being produced in these data sets, in these databases all the time. It's also quickly changing. as Molly pointed out, the algorithms by which these things function are changing at rates that we don't even know what they're changing at rates because nobody tells us the rates that they're changing at. But also the way in which people use them, the actors that are prevalent on them, they're changing sort of way faster than anything we really ever had to study before as social scientists. So they're massive and quickly changing. But here's the flip side of it. They're also optimized for search, right? Like that literally is what Google is. But lots of things, like if you go on Twitter and you want to find a bunch of tweets, you can just search for tweets on that topic. So what do you get when you combine those two things? What you get is a situation where it's very easy for anyone to come up with evidence of anything happening on social media, make a little graph that goes with it, show 3 tweets, throw it up on a TV screen, and you're describing a massive phenomenon that's going on in the United States on social media or in another country. Everyone can do this. And you throw into this hunger for people right now, especially in the United States post-2016, to understand what's going on in the social media platforms. You have a situation where anyone can produce evidence of anything. At the same time, actually doing rigorous scientific research to try to understand what's going on can be enormously time-consuming and expensive. That involves large research teams working with massive data, that involves social scientists who didn't previously have the kind of skills to work with this kind of data, collaborating with computer scientists. So just to give like one example of this, we did a project in the SMAP lab looking at the evolution of hate speech on Twitter over the course of the 2016 US election campaigns. When I give this talk normally, we start off and we have like lots of newspaper headlines on the screen talking about the massive rise of hate speech on Twitter over the course of the election campaign. We have lots of great theoretical reasons to think that this might have happened. But we actually spent about a year with a team of 7 people headed by Alex Siegel, who's also part of our committee here, who's here with us today, looking at the evolution of hate speech across essentially 1.2 billion tweets over a 2-year period that included 750 million political tweets, but also another 400 million tweets from a random sample of Twitter users that we were using. And the short story is, we don't find an increase in hate speech over this period of time. Now there's a million caveats, I can talk about all of them, and the paper's up on the SMAP Lab website, you can check them out yourself. But what we found was that hate speech was bursty. It went up a bunch of times, it goes up a bunch of times in a lot of different cases, but in all cases it re-equilibrates back to the base level that it was before. Now that base level might be something you think is very high normatively, or you might think it's very low. We're not making a normative statement on it, but that base level is a few tenths of a % of the tweets that we're encountering, right? So that's an example of the fact that you can easily get a story that seizes the popular narrative, right? You can easily end up in a situation where you have members of the British Parliament asking you about the explosion of hate speech online over the course of this period of time, and you have to try to explain to them that actually you and a team of people spent a year trying to look into this, and that's not what you found when you looked into this at this kind of level of the data. So I think this is a really big point to know. It's not only that we, and this is why I think all of us on this panel keep emphasizing it, it's not only that we don't know that much about this, it's that everybody else thinks they know a lot about it. And that combination is, I think, facilitated by the nature of this data, by the fact that so many people are interacting with it, by the fact that it's optimized for search. And so that puts the onus on us to get this stuff right. It's even more important. Now, our ability to learn, and people have made this point, so I'll go through it quickly, is severely constrained by what platforms choose to share. If you look at the vast majority of academic research that is done on social media platforms in advanced and established democracies, it is all, 90% of it or more is done on Twitter. Now, academics like Twitter, academics like to talk on Twitter, that's not necessarily the reason all these studies are done on Twitter. From the portion of politics and news media, it's not a bad place to be. A lot of people on it, there's a lot of talk about politics. But we all would love to be doing these same exact studies on Facebook. And the reason we're doing it on Twitter is because Twitter, to their credit, has made this data possibly accessible to academics for quite some time. But the key thing to understand is that Twitter could change its mind about that tomorrow. And they could just say, we're not going to make this data available anymore. Or they could say, we're going to charge you for this data that you've been able to download for free previously. And this entire field of research, most of what people here have heard about on the research space, would kind of disappear overnight. So we don't know a lot. We've learned some things. There's so many things we'd like to learn. But what we can learn is a function of what the platforms at this point choose to make available for research. The next point I want to make is that, and I made this point about in the United States, right? Some places, Twitter is actually the most important game in town, like Saudi Arabia, where Twitter is probably the platform that you want to be doing research on. But the point that I want everyone in this room to keep in mind as we think about recommendations coming out of this, as we think about the policy, is that a lot of us are thinking about this today in terms of what should be happening in the United States. After all, we're in the US. We're thinking about white papers that we hope will be able to influence US policymaking. There's some discussion about what's going to happen. You know, there's been some discussion this morning about what's going to happen in Europe as well. But social media is widespread around the world. And the results of what's going to happen in these kinds of deliberations here in the United States, in other advanced industrialized democracies, will have reverberations around the rest of the country, around the rest of the world. And so if we begin to walk down roads where we say that governments have the right to tell platforms what to take down from social media, that will be something that will have an effect in authoritarian countries as well as in democracies. So there are big picture implications here for what's done in this kind of sphere, right? Again, social media started off as liberation technology because it was a very valuable tool for pro-democracy activists in non-democratic systems to use to deal with the constraints they face in terms of access to media. If we walk down a road where governments have the ability to tell platforms to remove information because the government has determined that it's fake news, right? Let alone seeing what's happened to that term in the US in the last year, right? But if we think about what that means for the use of social media around the world and for the tool that it's become for people around the world to communicate and to organize politically, it's a big implication. So I think we want to think about this. We want to think about this very carefully. The final thing I want to talk about is just, again, add my voice to the chorus of voices talking about the importance of data access, right? And I want to pitch this in sort of two ways. One is the way that everybody else has been talking about it so far, which is the immediate need for data access to assess all these claims that are being made. Everything we're saying here, we're trying to talk to you about what have been the political effects of social media usage, of this huge transformation in the way people consume information about politics. In order to answer that question, we need access to that data to answer that question. But there's a larger question out there, right, which is that what is ultimately, and I think a committee like this and this kind of approach and these white papers is the perfect place to be thinking about this. What are we as a society going to make of these enormous collections of data about human behavior that are being accumulated at unprecedented rates in the modern era? And I want to push for a way of thinking about this. And I want to close with a bit of a plea, because tomorrow we're going to hear from the privacy subcommittee. And I think that we need to begin to think about privacy not in the simplistic way of just privacy as a sort of normatively pleasing idea, right? Like, it is a normatively pleasing idea. If I say to you, should your data be kept private or not? And you say, oh yes, it should be kept private. That seems like a very compelling argument. Like, we're all going to be on the same side of agreement in this, right? And if we push that to its logical extent, there should be full privacy of people's data. That means all of the data that's collected by platforms should be kept by the platforms and should never be shared with anyone ever again because of Cambridge Analytica, right? And again, it's normatively pleasing. However, that's not the actual world we live in, right? If what ends up happening is that all of the data that is kept by platforms is kept inside those platforms and is never shared with anybody else outside of those platforms, what that really means is that the single best data sets that have ever been accumulated for studying human behavior are going to be utilized to do what the platforms that collected them want to do. And that's it. Now, they may have we can pretty much assume they're going to use it to maximize ad revenue, right? They may use it for other things. There may be altruistic reasons. I don't want to ascribe it to them. But it would be a shame if the greatest data ever accumulated to address these scientific questions of how people behave is used basically to maximize ad revenue. And so I think what we really need to do is we need to begin to think about the privacy question as a trade-off between data access for social good, for research for social good, versus privacy concerns. So There are lots of things that can be used from these data. We've talked about a lot of them here, understanding all these questions that we keep saying we don't have answers to. That's certainly important, but there are other things you could do with these data. You may be able to do things about preventing addiction among teenagers. You may be able to do things with disaster relief, right? You may be able to figure out what the impact of these platforms are on political behavior. So the final thing I want to say, in contrast to the discussion this morning where Fiona was bringing up about academics and what academics' role should be in this. Academics, I think, are particularly paramount when we talk about data access here. Yes, there's absolutely value. I'm supportive of this digital authority having its own research, in-house research capacity. But I think the thing that makes academics special in this whole story is that we are the one actors who are basically incentivized to make our findings public. Academics get credit when what we've learned goes into the public domain. So I think the role of academics here, far from being irrelevant to the process, I think is actually crucial to the process. And when we think about this kind of data access, and Molly raised excellent points about, is it just data or do we need more than data? Do we need more things on this? I think this larger question about conceptualizing this as a trade-off between two things I think that are normatively desirable, maintaining people's privacy and at the same time taking this data set that's been harnessed and thinking about it in terms of its larger ability to contribute to society beyond just what it can do for the platforms that collected it is one of the major questions we should be addressing as we go forward. So thanks very much for your time, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. As a Brazilian, I only noticed that on the global aspect, I think that countries are already taking action despite the US, just as a small comment. Like you spoke about Singapore and all these other countries are already doing it. I think that my job has been made really easy because both Molly and John kind of raised the same question, which is, so Nolan and Joshua, what is the mechanism of accountability and how do you overcome this political power?
I think it's a very good question. I mean, as I tried to stress, the central problem with the political effects is not that there are political effects. I mean, there are positive ones, there are negative ones. It's that decisions about how they'll be deployed and develop over time are being made by very few political actors who then have incentives to not to be regulated. The first answer is that we should do something now because it is, as I mentioned, it's a period of time in which the popularity of these platforms is at a low. There's a lot of political support for doing things. So we need to do things now, but also to do things in which can kind of prevent the status quo from reemerging. So I do think in terms of accountability, I think the transparency initiatives are very important. In the publicity aspects. I think it's very important to have a regulatory authority or a regulatory regime which can detect bad behavior, algorithmic changes which have negative impacts on the political system, whether it's taking away some of the good aspects or exacerbating the bad ones, so that in there can be real-time political responses to those situations. If we get back into a situation where, we do a few things to regulate them now, but there's no way to kind of detect policy and algorithmic changes that move in bad directions and that a politically resuscitated industry is able to prevent those things from happening, I think we've squandered an opportunity. So I think the main thing is to do things now, to open up the transparency, to get a better handle on how the algorithms and policies impact democratic systems and authoritarian systems, and then have ongoing accountability by having a regulator with the capacity to monitor those changes, to detect when things go off the rails.
Okay, so I've heard the question, Molly, and I guess John as well. Is there a possible mechanism of accountability? How do you see it? Do you see any future for this project or not?
Okay. So my concern is that if we rush to regulation, just as if you really believe that the platforms are very powerful politically now, and you designed a regulatory authority which wasn't designed really well, the downside could be large. It could get captured by the current government in power. And I think the downside to doing this wrong is very, very large on the political side. And so I think a lot of thought has to be put into, because it's not symmetric returns, right? I mean, there's a lot of downside. And So there's things I think which you can fast walk, such as data transparency, disclosures, a whole bunch of transparency initiatives. Those could be done quickly, but designing a regulatory authority, and at least in the political sphere, needs to be done very carefully. We know from cable television regulation, we tried to regulate the economics of cable television, and they constantly appealed to First Amendment protections, and then all kinds of things began to go off the rails in cable television regulation. And so you can think about when you have some First Amendment protections, you're trying to protect content. Trying to regulate is really, really, really hard because you're trying to regulate on one dimension, and they have a freedom, a second dimension on which the companies can move and claim exemption from the regulation. So that's how I think about it. I'm not saying it should or should not be regulated, but if you head down that road, it needs to be done very carefully.
I think one method of accountability is to think a little bit about consumers and what consumers believe about their consumption. So I think we've already seen in the past few years a lot of publicity around the fact that there has been a lot of misinformation on social media. And there is some social science research that tells us that consumers can be smart consumers of news, where they can update their beliefs based on what they think the biases of the content that they're receiving are. And so I think even without consumers moving to other companies, the impact of more transparency or more research about how content is being given to consumers can help consumers figure out what filter to apply to the content that they are consuming. So I think one of the problems that we have, and we see this around the world, I've done a lot of work in China to try to understand how people respond to invisible versus visible manipulation of content in social media in China. People are much more affected when they don't know how the content is being changed, and because they have no mechanism of updating their beliefs based on how they think the content is coming to them. And so I think that's a really important component of accountability is educating the public about how to consume news.
So on this question of how are we going to be able to overcome the political power of the platforms, if that's the problem that's causing it, and it's been very well stated by the discussants here. I think one possibility comes from one of the things that Nolan said, which is that these were not platforms that were created to deliver a political product, right? They were platforms that were created to deliver a different type of product, a social networking product, a search product, all sorts of different things. I don't think we can remove entirely the possibility that we might not find receptivity on the part of the platforms for coming up with a set of regulatory mechanisms that will allow them to begin to disentangle themselves from the barrage of criticism that they find themselves under now related to the political implications of their platforms, right? We did a survey about Constitution in American institutions over last summer, right? And it was crazy. Facebook, we had all sorts of different institutions. Most of these institutions, it varied by partisanship, what you thought about the institution. But Facebook was squarely at the bottom in terms of competence of institutions across both Democrats and Republicans, right? Like, the political implications of these products have become a threat to the business model of these products. And to the extent that we can come up with a way where we begin to give them a path forward to say, look, all this data you're collecting, it's not like you're not going to be able to continue to use it to improve your product or continue to use it to maximize revenues. But we're going to give you a way to be able to point to the fact that this data is actually doing something beneficial for society. And Nolan's point, like that he made in the course of the talk that he was making, well, we're only going to see the data that comes out of Facebook when it's positive for Facebook, right? We make this point in the report that no matter what Facebook is doing, whether they're actually releasing studies, that they think are the most interesting or they think are the most rigorous or not, that's exactly what people are going to think, right? We know they have the data. We know they are doing research in-house. If we only see a little bit of that research released into the public, there's always going to be skepticism for it. If we hold open a door where this product they're created can be seen as this sort of enormous contribution to scientific development and enormous contribution to solving problems in society, this may be like a really strong kind of path forward for a slightly modified business model to deal with a problem that they may not, that a lot of people think they didn't really see coming.
Okay, I think I'll ask one last question that we open to questions from the audience. How does this change with the fact that like Mark Zuckerberg jumps in an op-ed and say, hey, we think you should all regulate us, and here are the 4 areas that you should regulate us? Do you think that there's any implication? Is he just trying to protect his own business, say what John is saying, like raise the barriers to entry or anything, or is it being benevolent, or what is your take on it?
I mean, I think, historically, lots of firms have sought regulations on their own terms. I mean, part of it is to deal with the situation Josh is describing. They have to rebuild their reputation. They need some third-party verification of what they're doing in order to rebuild their reputation. So, I mean, I guess the question will be is, the sorts of things that Mark Zuckerberg puts on the table, what Google puts on the table, is it going to be enough? Whether or not self-regulation itself will be enough? Whether they actually need a more active governmental authority to provide that verification and insurance that they're not hiding research or hiding the impacts of their algorithms, to make sure that once the initial public scrutiny wears off, that they don't backslide. I think those are the problems. I don't think it's that remarkable that the industry itself is asking for some regulation because they need it for exactly the reasons that Josh says. But I think in underscoring the things that John said, we want to look to the long term. We want to make sure that these things are durable so that, when the public scrutiny disappears, that we don't have new and undetected negative impacts because we didn't regulate enough now.
Okay, so we're open for questions. Anyone has any? Lior.
So I want to maybe pick up where Josh goes.
Just 1 second.
So I want to pick up on the really interesting points that Joshua made about privacy and how to think about it. So I think you framed the issue really well. And I guess what I want to say is, isn't there an easier answer here than either of the extremes, which is totally open up Facebook or let Facebook decide to be completely closed off? And to me, the sort of sensible compromise solution is to do something like the following, which is to say, let's select 10,000 Americans who are on Facebook, compensate them, and have them agree to have their Facebook activity studied in the same way that we can study anyone's Twitter activity today. And I guess the reason that seems like the appealing compromise, and I'd love to know why it's not, or if it's not, why it's, or if it is, great, that's a short answer for you, is from a privacy perspective, what often happens is that we put out a data set, re-identification of individuals is not possible in 2010, and then because of advances in computing power and new techniques, in 2014, it turns out you can identify particular users. And so AOL's gotten into huge trouble for benevolently trying to share information under a certain set of assumptions that it wouldn't be able to identify individuals, and then, oh, whoops, it turns out you can identify grandmas in Alabama and see what they were, doing on social media. So I guess the question I'd frame this way: if we've already got Twitter, and as you say, Twitter could change their policies, but we do have this very rich source of data, we have some reason to think that what's true about Twitter is probably going to be true about Facebook, since it's a lot of the same people using the similar technologies. Isn't the right solution?
I wish I had you to talk to reviewers for me.
Isn't the best solution here the sort of compromise between our two committees to say something like, let's select a sample population, create a panel of 10,000 Facebook users, oblige Facebook to share that information, compensate those users, make sure they know what they're getting into, and then watch how they behave over time in a way that preserves the privacy of the other 200 million Americans who are on Facebook and would have these privacy concerns?
So I think the short answer to that is that, again, I wasn't saying it should be one or the other. I was just saying I want to reconceptualize the discussion as a trade-off between preserving privacy of people who use platforms versus the social benefit of allowing access to researchers to this data, as a story of otherwise it will only be used by enormously powerful, huge multinational corporations, and thinking of that as a trade-off. where we land on that trade-off is much farther, I think, than we can talk about right here. I mean, we had a whole conference on this question in the fall. We have white papers on that topic. I mean, there's a lot of people, I think, thinking a lot of different ways about how to do this. And we would want, I mean, I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying we do want to preserve the privacy, but we want to think about it. The solution you've put forward is like one of the ideas people are working with. You could actually, what you're proposing, I mean, literally, we've been discussing this with other teams as doing this proposal. You could actually do that without the cooperation of the companies, because as long as people will download their data and send it to you, that's possible. So that you just kind of need funding for, and a big source of funding. You could build that panel, and like we actually have like things written along those lines, right? Doing that. Now, some of the stuff. But I think that's a good start, and that's a solution, and that's probably something that should definitely be done. There's a larger question about the questions about like what Molly's talking about. You know, if we don't have algorithmic transparency to go with that, how will we be able to understand what's happening in that particular set of data? Is 10,000 the right number? Is it a larger number, right? When you get into situations where things happen that you want to see breadth and reach of subpopulations, is your 10,000 person sample going to, you know? So I think you and I could have a long discussion about whether that's good. I think it's a great step forward. I think it's a very valuable model, and I think one that would work. But I think, just to be very clear what I was saying before, I think there's a lot of hard work to be done to parse out where we land and how we maximize both of these preserved benefits. But I think starting to have this discussion is where we should be headed. And then the question is, right, whether that can be done voluntarily, you know, or with these kind of workarounds, or whether that's something that this digital authority could play a kind of large role in kickstarting.
Thanks.
I just want to say one comment on that. There's also the census is moving towards synthetic data sets, where you can actually have simulated data sets that mimic the real set of data with verification servers. So I've been on a project for the past 3 years trying to do this with government data and trying to replicate through synthetic data sets, which have differential privacy in them. And that's another method. So there's a whole host of different methods you could use where you protect privacy. I just wanted to say that.
So you're absolutely right. You don't need anybody's permission to do that. You can ask people to download their data, even automate it. And in fact, there's a data transfer project that will make it completely automatic to go from being downloaded to being aggregated in a database. However, I will tell you that managing a panel is not an easy thing. It becomes unbalanced very quickly. It requires a substantial amount of attention and effort to make that work. You might also look at Nielsen and Comscore, who have existing panels focused primarily around advertising and marketing issues, but they may have the kind of data you want, and they've provided data to academics before. And finally, one last point about data. Nobody mentioned Google Trends. Google Trends is a fantastic source of data that I've worked with for several years, and many other people around the world. There are over 1,000 citations to Google Trends in Google Scholar. And another tool that people aren't quite as aware of is consumer surveys, which allows you to do kind of instant surveys. And there's also a panel of users of mobile phones, mobile apps. It's an unbalanced panel, not a balanced panel, because that's, as I mentioned, that's so expensive to actually run. But that's a great idea. I mean, lots of people have looked into this, and all that's needed is some money. Right. So that should be easily solved.
Just a small response to that.
Money, but also just very quickly, money but the other thing with this is that there is this sort of floating barrier of terms of service, and you might invest in being able to do something, and then the terms of service changes, and then you're not able to go about doing that after you've said. I mean, so this is the situation that people find themselves in when they're trying to do these things.
If you want to give it to somebody else, that's your choice. Okay, there's no term of service that's going to impact that, because how do you know what somebody does with the data once they've downloaded it? That's part of the problem that Facebook ran into.
We have time for
Just one point on the panels. I think one of the things we'd like to know is the online behavior of neo-Nazis, and the question about whether neo-Nazis will sign up and stay on a panel is something we have to be concerned about. Yeah. Exactly,
Right.
exactly.
We have time for one last final quick question. Dina, you wanted to ask a question?
So, Hal, I just actually wanted to respond to something that you said. In terms of users exporting their data, I think there's still a lot of friction in terms of users exporting their data and then re-importing it into other services. Oh, okay, got it. Is that going to facilitate sort of exporting my past emails into other email services? Because that would truly reduce friction in terms of users switching services.
So in principle, yes. But note, all of your correspondence also have record in your email. So how are we going to deal with the privacy issue of all the mail to you is now moved to a different provider? So if you tell me the answer to that problem, I'll tell you, we're happy to do the data transfer project, to move your email from place to place. We just want to make sure it doesn't expose us to 4% fine on world revenues.
Okay, I guess with this promise, we're going to conclude now. Thank you very much, and we'll restart in 15 minutes with the following discussion on politics as well. Thank you.